First of all, apologies to the speakers for turning up late, and to yourselves, slightly disrespectful, only because my watch stopped. So anyway, glad to be here. So what I want to try and do, even though that was a fantastic build-up about my controversy, maybe this may be a bit more mainstream, but just in case anybody is offended by my criticism of community organisations, first of all, let me just say that having been here on Wednesday and seen the community choirs and had tears running down my cheeks in an old sentimentalist sort of way, it's a fantastic exploration about what kind of people coming together, expressing themselves communally can really do. So I'm not having a go, I'm not having a pop at anybody necessarily in this room. I'm more looking at kind of the political definitions and the political use, coming on to what you were saying in the beginning, the kind of the notions about constructing communities and how that's been put forward in a certain artifice being given to communities which maybe they didn't used to be. I want to look at what communities are and what they aren't to a certain extent, and what it is about communities that politicians are trying to capture and bottle and sell back to us as the elixir of the new society. So, you know, there's all sorts of models, if I can get this working, on how we organize communally, artificial ways of organizing. This is Nazi Germany in 1944, health and beauty of people kind of coming together to express themselves in that way. Perhaps another example of a somewhat more dangerous way of organizing, you know, is and how we kind of maybe should or shouldn't kind of commune together is a much more direct televisual example about how neighbors should love one another. But I know all different types of way that we kind of express this kind of networking is now reaching its kind of culmination in the airbrushed David Cameron, if you don't recognize him, British Prime Minister. The big society is the new agenda. And this is partly what I want to try and get across. Why is it that the community motif, which historically and almost definitionally means local and parochial, is now becoming central to a national governmental agenda? So he wants communities with oomph. This is a new manifesto commitment, oomph communities. And the big society is, you know, you could say it started, I mean, to pick an arbitrary point, 1995, Robert Putnam's work, his essay, and then his 2000 book, Bowling Alone, which looked at the whole fragmentation of society, the breakdown of social capital, and how we can rebuild it and reconstitute it, has now reached its apogee in this discussion about central to government policy. I mean, the only government policy, to a large extent, is rebuilding broken Britain and reorganizing communities. Just as an aside, I don't know whether you've noticed a similarity here in, if this works. How does this work? This isn't good. Should I do that way? Yeah, that's it. And obviously, the difference is that, you know, one of them obviously has a blank robotic stare, and the other one is that character from Star Trek. But I think, just to kind of go back, the point for me is that, you know, 200 years ago we had the, you know, Enlightenment politics, which kind of framed the way that we saw the world for the following 100, maybe even 200 years, about, you know, battles for reason and science and autonomy. Then we had, for 100 years, we had ideological kind of battles of ideas about left and right-wing politics. Then in the most recent, maybe 30 years or so, we've had discussions about human rights and equality and freedom and fighting racism. And now we have a situation where the previous administration is talking about litter. Whereas John Prescott talked, well, he didn't talk, if you ever heard the guy, talked about the urban renaissance, whereas we in architecture thought he might be talking about urban renaissance being boulevards and Manhattan loft living and Italian cafe culture. In fact, what he was after was campaigning against litter and abandoned cars and graffiti. And he was very instructive in saying that this is kind of central to ordinary people's concerns. And therefore, as a politician, he had to be reflective of that, and therefore local issues, neighborhood issues, small-scale issues about litter were going to be kind of central to government policy. And that was what the urban renaissance was going to become about. Instead of a nation of shopkeepers, we were going to become a nation of mop keepers, cleaning up our local areas, and only if we could do that would we then earn the right for an urban renaissance? So there's a long history of this kind of small-scale politicking masquerading on a national agenda, which I think is kind of quite instructive. This is David Cameron's first speech on the subject of the big society, one of his models about how maybe to build community of engagement, of basically getting ex-offenders to make damaged flat-pack furniture and sell it to students. He saw this as a fantastic example about the camaraderie of the workforce and the kind of having an idea about what you can do for society beyond yourself. Whereas, in fact, it's a sort of an IKEA version of sewing mailbags. And it's a very dismal vision about how we can organize. Within that kind of framework, there may be kind of people chatting and engaging and seeing maybe some bigger picture, but the way to get there is faintly reactionary in my book. So, here's one example of a community. This is Wootton Bassett, a small town in Wiltshire near RAF Lyneham. And they are, and it's a town modeled to a certain extent. Their entire identity is based on the proximity of RAF Lyneham Air Force area. And this is a community coming out, about 85% apparently, the community came out to pay respects to people who'd been killed in Iraq. A spontaneous lining of the streets, which I think is kind of quite an interesting kind of community engagement strategy. But then if you do then think, if you were an 18-year-old anti-war activist who happened to be living in Wootton Bassett, this would be an example of hell, rather than an example of fantastic community spiritedness. So I just think that communities in and of themselves, and celebrating them, we have to recognize that actually there are many aspects to them, some of which can be on the surface seem to be positive, but actually we have to untangle the fact that indeed maybe they are a problem as much as they are a solution. Communities are parochial, is part of my argument. In terms of communities, and these are kind of three key elements, I think, which make up real communities. They're not kind of mutually exclusive, and it's certainly not an extensive list, but voluntarism, purposefulness, and autonomy, I think, are essential ingredients to a genuine community. So in terms of voluntarism, this is a kind of quote from Volunteering England, which is a mango in Britain, talking about the fact that volunteering is about doing something for nothing. And obviously, as opposed to being a professional, working for nothing is an essential ingredient into voluntarism, except for the fact there are an inordinate amount of paid volunteers, funnily enough. But this is a more kind of instructive part of the quote, which says that it's freely undertaken. And that doesn't mean for free in the same way. It means willingly and uncoercedly and generously given. It's a gift. To volunteer is a gifted action. So when you have a situation now where David Cameron, as part of his demand to reconfigure civil society and civic engagement and social capital, is arguing that 16-year-olds have a duty to volunteer, slightly you sometimes have this kind of new contradictory mandate, compulsory volunteering. And I think it's a similar thing with constructing communities. These things are contradictions in terms. A little bit like rap music, or Australian fashion. That's a little high-risk one there. Or imposing democracy. I mean, most of us kind of maybe recognize that imposing democracy is a little bit illegitimate, whereas constructing communities we seem to go along with a little bit too readily, I think. So that's a fundamental problem. The second one, in terms of purposefulness, another strategy of the big society agenda and the Conservative or the coalition government in Britain is the big lunch, which is what we used to call the government making a meal out of having no political agenda. But the big lunch is retaining massive amount of funding, and it's basically getting people to organize street parties in order to then meet their neighbors and develop a sense of community spiritedness. So whereas in the past, people would get together and organize a street party in order to celebrate something, now the very thing they're celebrating is the street party itself. So it's a completely corrosive, insular idea. In matter of fact, a colleague of mine organized one in South London and got into competition with a neighboring street to see who could have the best street party. And of course, they all then fell out. And so you had a situation where a community which actually was getting along very well, thank you very much, fell apart on the basis of a strategy intended to keep it together. And then you have autonomy. The government, again, is very keen on people building communities autonomously, provided that they're the right sort of community. This is the Peace Camp in Parliament Square, which was almost an exemplar of self-generating people coming together to work together, organise together, and live together. And it was cleared by the police 2 months ago for being the wrong place, wrong time, wrong idea. And I think that you can have any number of visions about what your view of community is, from Hells Angels to the Amish, and all points in between. And the point I'm making about autonomy is that I think that you have to allow them to stand and fall on their own merits, rather than maybe kind of have a sanitized vision about what the correct form of community organisation is and ought to be. And indeed, what is happening in Britain, this guy on the left is called Nathaniel Way. You'll never have heard of him. He's come from nowhere. He's now been given he's now in the House of Lords for his work on the Big Society. 33-year-old. The other chap is Douglas Hurd's son, Nick Hurd, who's the minister for the Big Society, and Douglas Hurd, his dad, is also a lord. So you have a lord and a son of a lord imposing democracy. That's the contradiction in terms again. But they want to kind of find local residents with an aptitude for this kind of big society agenda, which they've already set for us, who can then get training by professional trainers to motivate neighbours to take part in these kind of community schemes. So it's almost this nightmare Orwellian vision of those net curtain twitching busybodies coming round telling you that you have to get involved in your neighbourhood watch scheme that in fact I have no interest in doing whatsoever. So I think, again, part of the autonomy is that the right not to take part in community as much as take part in it, rather than being seen as a pariah or be ostracised in the very process. And that's what's in danger of happening in a number of these politicised schemes. So my final example is, this is a Brazilian woman in Gort, a town in Galway in Ireland. And this is what I would think is an interesting example, not a model, but an interesting example about what could happen if people actually are just left alone to their own devices. Gort is a village of 2,000 people, or at least it was until 6 years ago, when 1,500 Brazilians arrived in Gort over the process of 5 years. The meatpacking industry in Innopolis in Brazil was collapsing, and they moved into this area. And basically, 40% of the population is now Brazilian. The street signs are in Portuguese. This is the community centre. This is the football team, which unsurprisingly are doing quite well in the local league. And basically, it just showed none of the racism or attacks or anything that you might imagine might have happened, and effectively they all got along swimmingly, even though the recession is now kicking in and unemployment is rising. There's still a remarkably lacking in tension. It's a kind of a really interesting place to take a look at. So when we come back to this kind of vision about Cameron's vision of communities with oomph, and this idea of neighbourhoods feel that they can club together and get involved to shape the world around them, that's only interesting if you think that the world around you is your neighbourhood. I think that by definition, the world is a bigger place than your neighbourhood. And so communities have to be seen. My final points, if I will, my final point is that effectively communities are things of flux. They are of change and not in aspic. And I think that's something to be celebrated. So the Gort example is interesting in as much as Gort's communitarian spirit has arisen out of the destruction or the collapse, or whatever you want to call it, of two prior existing communities. And if community activists had been involved in Brazil, maybe they would have encouraged those young people not to leave Brazil, but to retain and fight for their own communities. So I think communities are states of flux out of which you then transcend the local, which I think is fundamental to really seeing the world something beyond your neighbourhood and having a bigger world vision and getting involved in politics as politics, not local neighbourhood politics. I suppose finally my culmination of that is to say that if we then see neighbourhoods, not in aspect necessarily, but see them as fragile and the people within them as fragile, needing help and assistance to organise and reorganise those communities, then we demean the very people who are actually doing that on the ground without our help. Thank you very much. Cheers.